here, we're going to start with Germany and the Energiewende energy crisis. I also want to say real quick, a big thank you to Catherine Lewis, our energy policy analyst, who put together these slides on Germany, but she was unable to present to you today. So hopefully I do her justice, but I will admit that I never took German, and I apologize ahead of time for all of my pronunciation. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to walk you through the history of what led to the 2022-23 energy crisis in Germany. There are several factors and actions that precipitated this event, which I will walk you through. And given that it's been a few years now, we can discuss lessons learned, such as how to prevent this, how they are currently mitigating the problem, and how we can learn from this in the US. Next slide, please. So, the Energiewende in Germany refers to the energy transition the country has initiated in order to switch to primarily renewable energy. With the current transition starting in 2010, the initial goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% by the year 2050, compared to the 1990 levels at the time. In order to do this, Germany was aiming for about 60% renewable energy by 2050. They were also aiming to decommission all coal plants by the year 2038. And just so you know, the emissions goal was actually not unlikely for Germany because they had consistently decreased decreased since 1990. However, several other decisions would more greatly impact what came to be known as the energy crisis. Next slide, please. So, in order to meet their emission and renewable goals, Germany created a plan to phase out their coal-fired generation. So in 2011, when the energy transition started, coal generation capacity accounted for just under 25% of Germany's energy mix. And as of 2023, this has only dropped to 17.6%. The country has had to stifle its efforts to reduce reliance on coal energy due to arising issues, which we will dive into next. Next slide, please. A more controversial but significant aspect of the proposed Energiewende was the phase-out of nuclear energy in Germany. At the time, nuclear accounted for around a quarter of the country's power and was also their primary clean and no greenhouse gas energy resource. This resulted from public concerns regarding the international incidents related to nuclear power, such as 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima. The nuclear power was set to be phased out of Germany starting in 2011. Next slide, please. So, from 2011 to 2023, Germany retired around 13,000 megawatts of nuclear power. The last 3 reactors had been kept online for an extra year due to energy shortages, but the plants ultimately were shut down, marking the official decommissioning of all previously operating 17 nuclear reactors. This loss of nuclear power was significant and contributed to energy shortages and high prices. So correspondingly, energy reliance then shifted towards imported natural gas. Next slide, please. The reliance on natural gas, even though it was only meant to be a bridge between the phase out of coal and nuclear energy and the transition to renewables, ended up culminating into the energy crisis. Germany itself produces very little natural gas, although a majority of homes are heated with it, and it is widely used in the industrial sector. This means that Germany is a net importer of natural gas, and in 2021, as you can see here, 55% of it came from Russia, given that it was inexpensive and easy to obtain. Germany had been relying on this imported gas as a safe, cheap, and temporary fuel, as we said earlier, to compensate for nuclear and coal power losses in the initial phase of Energiewende. The trade had been presented as a mutual dependency. However, this quickly and unexpectedly changed for Germany in 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they had to revise this plan. Next slide, please. There was a debate about how to reduce Russian imported natural gas, given that it provided a significant amount of energy, an embargo would likely lead to economic decline. In February 2022, imports from Russia decreased substantially due to sanctions from both sides and the war's influence on trade and infrastructure. Germany stopped receiving pipeline gas from Russia entirely in August of 2022. Oil imports from Russia also were halted, further impacting the country's ability to power their grid. Given that in 2022, we now know that nearly all nuclear power plants had been decommissioned by that time, coal plants were retiring, and now all Russian oil and gas imports were cut off, Germany was officially in an energy crisis. Next slide, please. The reduced energy supply resulted in higher costs of power across the country, dampening the German economy. Researchers indicated that firms impacted by the energy price increases showed growth in sales, but they were missing their own decarbonization targets. German households were, and some still are, paying around 31% more for electricity than they were pre-crisis. Next slide, please. Germany was also reportedly missing their countrywide greenhouse gas emissions goals. Emissions went up in 2022, as you can see in this chart here, given that nuclear power was retiring and gas prices skyrocketed, so coal-powered energy was heavily relied on, with the country reopening 10 gigawatts to compensate for this. This energy crisis resulted in an interesting emissions trend, as you see here, with the emissions initially going up due to the use of coal to counterbalance the shock of losing that cheap Russian gas. Next slide, please. Emissions then dropped 20% in a single year due to the population and the greater industry curbing the use of energy altogether, given how expensive it was. Cities pushed for energy-saving efforts by dimming lights, as you see here, reducing heating and air conditioning, and encouraging cold showers. What this entire situation resulted in, beyond high electricity costs, a faltering economy, and low power supply, was a large reliance on intermittent renewable energy. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned, one of the primary goals of the Energiewende was aiming for 60% renewable energy by 2050. Germany had a boom of renewable energy development from around 2000 to 2010 and was easily meeting targets it had set in place at that point in time. After this decade, around 23% of the power in Germany could be contributed to these power sources. One of the unique aspects of Energiewende, which really ramped up in 2011, is that it was to drive the transition primarily through citizens and sought to involve them more in the policy-making process, and to increase the transparency for renewable energy project plans and approvals. However, this change in energy composition also required serious infrastructure and transmission upgrades, projects the public wasn't necessarily supportive of. By 2015, the Energiewende monitoring report showed that the climate targets were in serious danger, and in 2020, that emission reduction targets were likely to be missed considerably. Bureaucratic measures and not in my backyard or NIMBYism slowed down several renewable energy projects. Energy prices were not really dropping since nuclear energy generation was simultaneously retiring, and the public grew increasingly frustrated. Next slide, please. To this day, Germany is still increasing the share of renewable energy, but it remains slow-moving. In 2024, Germany experienced what they termed the Dunkelflaut. The country went through a prolonged period of cloudy and windless weather, which did not bode well for solar and wind energy. In the summer of 24, around a quarter of Germany's electricity was produced from solar alone, but in November, during Dunkelflaut, it only accounted for 4.3%. This lack of renewable energy caused wholesale prices to spike. At times, a megawatt hour cost up to €1,000, the highest level recorded in 18 years. This happened during a time when power consumption was high during the cold winter. To compensate, Germany relied on imported fossil fuels and nuclear power from its neighbors. This instance exemplifies the current situation in Germany, one that is prone to feeling strong impacts from unexpected events. Next slide, please. The need for fuel and supplier diversity is apparent in Germany, but the country and the world is learning from this and adjusting, slowly, as needed. Since the energy crisis, Germany's economy is on the up and up, and plans are being made on how to shield their country from power price fluctuations if the supply is disrupted or other global events occur again. Just last month, Germany announced their positively shifting view on nuclear power. A French official confirmed in a Financial Times report that Germany had signaled it was dropping its long-held opposition to nuclear power. New German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who had been who had sorry, Friedrich Merz, who has called exiting nuclear energy a mistake, has promised a reset in relations with France. Berlin was also becoming increasingly isolated, with many European countries planning to revive nuclear power to replace gas flows from Russia. This work to realign climate and power policies is still in discussion, but signals growth out of the energy crisis. Next slide, please. We like to say here at RF that every instance, good or bad, is an opportunity to learn and adapt. This years-long energy crisis in Germany did not arise due to a single decision, but a series of them. By no means do we place blame or judgment on any of these decisions, but we believe that studying and learning from them can help us bolster the reliability of the grid here in the US. One critical lesson is the importance of diversified energy resources. Germany's reliance on Russian natural gas left the country in a precarious situation when this was unexpectedly disrupted. A diversified energy portfolio means that another source can compensate for this loss without feeling significant environmental or economic impacts. This same thing can be said for having diversified suppliers. A planned and consistent process for transitioning fuel sources is also key. Losing a primary consistent power source like nuclear over the course of just 10 years would be very difficult to do, especially without concrete plans and upgrades alongside this. In this same vein, long-term planning and having wide margins for inevitable change and unpredictable events, whether that is global relations, extreme weather, or anything like that, is critical to maintaining reliability. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so now we're going to move over to another study case, and this time it's Sri Lanka. And I'm going to move quickly due to the time. Next slide, please. Similarly to what we just spoke about with Germany, now we're concentrating on Sri Lanka and their history of blackouts, which will include a deeper dive on the most recent February 2025 island-wide blackout. There are several factors and actions that precipitated this event, which I will walk you through. And remember, while the island nation of Sri Lanka has several differences compared to the US grid, we will discuss these differences and what we can learn and apply back here in the US. Next slide, please. First, just to level set us, Sri Lanka is an island nation in the Indian Ocean with a population of approximately 22 million. So to bring that to US terms, think of that as about the size of Ohio and Pennsylvania together. And given the history of Sri Lanka, going back as far as the king who ruled the country in 1153, and whose quote you now see here, it is perhaps no surprise that, if you click again, please, until the late 1990s, hydropower acted as the country's key energy generator, producing nearly the entirety of Sri Lanka's energy requirement. Though the government-owned utility responsible for power generation, transmission, and distribution in the country has published what they call a long-term generation expansion plan annually, no power plants were commissioned since 1992. And, coupled with a series of prolonged droughts and increasing demand, this resulted in the 1996 power crisis, a series of up to 8 hours of power cuts and ultimately a 4-day nationwide blackout. As you see in the chart here, Sri Lanka then began importing fossil fuels to ensure the security of their energy supply. Next slide, please. Fast forwarding to 2023, Sri Lanka's installed capacity is still strongly hydro, and those imported fossil fuels, like oil and coal, as well as some solar, wind, and beginnings of bioenergy. Today, most of the energy Sri Lanka consumes is imported. As you can see in the chart on the left, in 2022, 60% of their energy came from imports. While Sri Lanka has the potential for natural gas reserves, they have no in-country natural gas production, no LNG storage, and no regasification facilities, meaning that they depend on these imported fossil fuel sources, mainly oil and coal, for around 50% of their electric generation. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka is no stranger to island-wide blackouts. Remember, that's Ohio and Pennsylvania both blacked out. even after the 1966 blackout. If you could click, please. What you see here are just the beginnings of the major blackout years for the island nation, just the major ones, including this year, which we will be getting to in a moment. 1996, as we discussed earlier, was largely due to Sri Lanka's reliance, could you go back one? To Sri Lanka's reliance on hydropower and long droughts of that year, which led to the island nation's decision to have those heavily imported fossil fuels. 2001 was a similar story, heavy reliance on hydropower, more severe droughts. Jumping to 2016, they had several major blackouts where the cited causes ranged from technical issues to a key transformer bursting into flame. 2019, again, droughts with that hydro generation reliance, expensive fuels to import, coupled with several new generation power plants that failed to materialize, a failure in changing course despite warnings as far back as their 2013 released long-term generation expansion plan, blackouts. The 2020 nationwide blackouts occurred due to a transmission technical failure at a large substation, where basically a 300 megawatt oil-fired power station provided about 50% of the Sri Lankan energy supply failed for 7 hours. Couple that with a three-phase bus fault at the power station that was cleared in 154 milliseconds instead of the expected 30, which led to a 50% voltage dip at another power station, and then all the units tripped at both power stations, causing a rapid fall of frequency for more than 2 hertz a second, which basically means that the frequency dropped to 47 hertz in just 1.9 seconds. Meanwhile, 2022 was heavily influenced by the concurrent Sri Lankan economic crisis, which was their worst recorded economic crisis. And since they're major importers of fossil fuels, when they were unable to afford the imported additional fuels after depleting their fossil fuel reserves, the country was subjected again to multiple widespread blackouts. Finally, 2023, a major 220 kV line, which is their highest voltage on the island, unexpectedly tripped offline due to several lightning strikes, again, those supply shortages. Which brings us to the last light bulb up here, 2025. Next slide, please. Likely, you've already heard the trending headlines making their way around social media back in February. As you see the article here, the nationwide blackout on February 9, and the main suspect was a monkey. But we're going to look a little more into this event and see what we can learn and apply here. First, we're going to start with the most basic. You could click for a second. February 9, 2025 was a Sunday, not a work day for the industrial sector, and specifically, it was a hot, sunny Sunday. The blackout started just after 11 a.m. local time, when the sun would have been high overhead. Now, as of April 2024, Sri Lanka had 137 megawatt capacity of ground-mounted solar and 930 megawatts of rooftop solar, which in 2025 is over 1,000 rooftop. According to the investigations by the government-run utility, over 50% of the country's demand was being served by solar that day leading up to the blackout, what they called, quote, exceptionally high contribution. Meanwhile, just south of Colombo, the largest city by population in Sri Lanka, is the Panadura substation. You could click, please. It is also near here that the largest population of monkeys in Sri Lanka, which numbers about 44,000, live. So yes, the investigation officially states that a monkey entered the Panadura substation and caused a disturbance. That disturbance led to local low voltage issues, and since the grid didn't have enough inertial resources on at the time to absorb that disturbance, this led to cascading and ultimately the blackout. Next slide, please. And just one more look at the generation mix that day. Coal was at 120 megawatts, hydro at 60, utility scale solar and wind each at 20. And again, before you point out that 20 megawatts isn't half of the demand, you have to remember this is utility scale. If you could click, please. Sri Lanka has over 1,000 megawatts of rooftop solar, and about 800 of which was online and generating. So grid operators reduced dispatchable synchronous generation to compensate. Remember, Sri Lanka's grid is older, and the grid there is designed for one-way distribution, not bidirectional flow. And those same rooftop solar systems automatically disconnected after the voltage drop triggered by the substation disturbance, causing even more instability. And with few inertia providing units online and generating, that lack of synchronous generation already made the grid more vulnerable to voltage and frequency disturbances, which led to the cascading outages and ultimate blackout. Now, it is important to note that the initial disturbance at Panadura substation would have caused a significantly smaller outage if the system had been more resilient to voltage and frequency fluctuations. And also, just as a note, in Sri Lanka, the rooftop solar is not visible to the system control either. Next slide, please. In terms of lessons learned, Sri Lanka's utility urged that the long-term generation expansion plan and the long-term transmission plan measures be implemented. These plans called for battery energy storage systems, synchronous condensers, modifications to enable conventional generators to operate as synchronous condensers, and the installation of real-time inertia indicators on the control systems for operator awareness. As for what we in the US can take home and turn this case into an opportunity for everyone to learn from, remember the other factors we quickly reviewed a few slides ago. Sri Lanka's utility had published their long-term generation expansion plans every 2 years, signaling warnings as far back as their 2013 release that they needed more generation online to meet demand, that they needed to move away from reliance on hydro and expensive imported fuels, diversity in their generation to help mitigate the issues of any one generator type. They also have aging or poorly maintained infrastructure, the 2020 bus fault that cleared in 154 milliseconds instead of 30. And also noted in the February case, they also needed better insight into the inertia on the system at the time to properly dispatch and prepare their fleet, improving their internal controls and operator awareness tools. And finally, long-term planning and expecting the unexpected are critical to maintaining system reliability. If you could click for me real quick. Though we may be okay here in the US with the monkey population. Next slide, please. And that wraps up my presentation. Thank you for listening, and we'll take any questions. I do know I spoke a little long, sorry.
Courtney, that was fantastic. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you, Michelle.
Yes, thank you so much. That was very informative. We do have a couple of questions that came in through Slido for you. The first one is, you had a slide on going back to the Germany case study. Energy costs had sharply increased about the end of 2021 and then dropped beginning in 2022. So the question is, do you have any information on why the energy costs increased so sharply and then dropped again?
So my understanding of that point in time is that, again, in 2022, August 2022, that's when all of the natural gas and all of the oil from Russia, again, that cheap, easy to get gas, that's when that immediately got cut off. So that's right around that time when that spike went up, as you can see there. So they quickly, of course, had to scramble. Of course, there was, as you saw, increasing as everyone else in Europe was having the same kind of issues. And as I said earlier, right around January is when they started really trying to do that whole plea to the public, trying to say, hey, if we start decreasing our energy usage, we will be okay, we'll get through this. That's my understanding.
Very good. The next question asks if we have any information about Spain or Puerto Rico's recent blackouts. And I know you didn't focus on that here in your presentation today, but I just want to mention that we do have a LinkedIn post out there on some information about Spain's blackouts. So while when we get to the next presentation here, I'm going to go ahead and put that link in this question so that if anyone's interested, they can click on the link and read our LinkedIn post for that.
And keep in mind, ENTSOE is still currently investigating it, so keep an eye out for them as well.
Okay, the next question is, Sri Lanka coal units were at 300 megawatts and have been taken out since the dispatch required to be less than minimum for the large generators. So for those coal units that were too large for those systems were taken out, do you have any take on that or any more information that you had read about in your research?
The biggest information I had for the coal units, again, leading up right up to that, with that slide I showed you with the where everything was right before 11 o'clock, is that my understanding is that the operators were currently backing down a lot of the conventional stuff because there was so much solar coming in. So in order to kind of use that rooftop solar, which again is not in that diagram, I do apologize, but it's the rooftop solar that started coming in hot and heavy, 800 megawatts. They backed down a lot of their conventional stuff. So unfortunately, again, inertia issues as well at that point, couldn't recover.
Okay, and that is all I see so far here in